Purposely. Your life, God's purpose. Listen at purposely.com.
And he said to Mike, "Unless you walk through the doors God opens, he may not keep opening them for you." And I love that God is active. He wants to lead us. He wants to grow us.
Welcome to By Faith, a podcast series that tells the story of Christa Ministries founder Mike Martin and his extreme commitment to follow God's calling to plant seeds of hope. This podcast features interviews from many who were deeply involved in the earliest days of Christa, even before it was called Christa. It also features the stories found in the book By Faith that is now available at byfaithbook.com.
Today, we live in a world that's wondering, can God? Can God perform the miracles He did in the Bible? Can God really raise up leaders like He anointed back then? Can God move the mountains we're facing in our own lives? It's not that we doubt God can, but more so we doubt that He's willing. Or maybe we believe those promises and miracles were for another age, one that's passed us by. Yet Hebrews chapter 13 verse 8 tells us plainly, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Still, deep down, most of us question if those words are true. We pray, and our prayers go unanswered. We hope, and our hopes are dashed. We work, and nothing comes of it. Has God lost His power? Are His promises just for the saints of old? Why do we not experience the miracles that they did? The story of Mike Martin and his wife Vivian is a story of miracles. It's a story of prayers answered, mountains moved, and work accomplished. It's the story of a life that could only be realized by faith and nothing else. Mike Martin's life is a testament to the fact that God is still at work in the world, that miracles are not simply reserved for the days of Peter and Paul, but that the miraculous can still happen each and every day, if only we have the eyes to see and ears to hear. Come along as we embark on this incredible faith journey, witnessing how one man's simple yes led to the salvation of thousands upon thousands and birthed a ministry that continues to impact the world for the cause of Christ 75 years later. This is the story of Mike Martin. This is By Faith. Mike Martin was 27 years old when he first heard the voice of God. That initial encounter saved Mike's life, setting him on a completely different path from the slippery slope of reckless living he was venturing down. A few months later, Mike would hear from God again. This second time would transform Mike's life in even more permanent ways, serving as the beginning of what would eventually become his life's work, Christa Ministries. Christa, shorthand for Christianity in Action. Mike and Viv's youngest son, Michael Martin, has yet to be born at the time of his dad's audible encounters with the Lord. But their impact on his parents set in motion a movement of faith that could only be attributed to the hand of God on the family's life, inspiring Michael's own relationship with Jesus in the process.
I'm happy to tell you about my history and my name and all that. My name is Michael Martin, and I'm the youngest son of Mike and Vivian Martin. And I moved to the Christa campus, which was called King's Garden in those days, August 15, 1949. And during my childhood, I don't think anybody could have a more marvelous childhood because all the workers and their children lived on campus. And there were about 100 dorm kids who lived on campus. So when I wanted to play football after school, I always had companions who were willing to do this. And we rode our bikes down to Richmond Beach and to Edmonds and it was truly a wonderful time. Dad had a remarkable spiritual experience. How he became a Christian and a follower of Christ was by hearing God speak to him aloud. Well, I haven't had that experience of God speaking to me aloud. God has spoken to me, and I have had at least one dramatic healing in that kind of context. Dad sold his business, came over to Simpson Bible Institute near Woodland Park, and started a Christian ministry called King's Teens. And it was just a remarkable time in his life. Consequently, it was remarkable for me in my life. But at the end of World War II, Seattle was a center of a lot of Christian activity. World Vision was founded by Bob Pierce in Seattle. Young Life was founded here in Seattle. Christa Ministries was born here in Seattle, and so was the Navigators. There were many activities. Billy Graham came for the World Fair and spoke, and Dad was in charge of the counseling for that. So it was an outpouring of God's Spirit, and none of that frightened me.
A spiritual outpouring indeed. But before any of those ministries could become a reality, we must first return to Mike's initial encounter with the Lord and the implications of that divine appointment. By all accounts, Mike and Vivian Martin were living the 1930s American dream. Mike worked as the owner of a fairly successful service station in the Bellingham, Washington area. The Martins had 2 small children, and their lives consisted of attending dances, card playing, smoking, and drinking. Mike later said his greatest concerns during that time were with making money and enjoying life to the fullest. Little thought was given to the Lord, and no thought at all was given to death or any type of life after the one of excess and merrymaking the Martins were living. After another Saturday night of dancing and drinking, Mike and Viv came home and went to bed. The moonshine Mike had indulged in that night the last thing on their minds. When Sunday morning came, Mike didn't feel like himself. He stayed in bed, trying to recover enough to go to work on Monday. That's when Mike remembered bad moonshine had been going around, the kind that could cause blindness, paralysis, and in some cases, death. Was this sickness caused by the moonshine he drank last night? What if his symptoms got worse? Viv took care of her husband the best she could. But as Sunday went on and Mike lay in bed, he started to notice that he could no longer move his hands and feet. He tried calling out to Viv, only to find out that he had lost control of his voice. It was in this moment of complete helplessness that Mike became afraid. He had no idea what was happening, no idea what this poisonous moonshine could do to him, and as he lay there alone, unable to move, no longer able to speak, Mike began to wonder where would he go if he did in fact die on this Sunday afternoon. He was confirmed and baptized. Would he go to heaven? But he hardly ever thought about the Lord, much less followed his commands. Would he go to hell? In his desperation, Mike cried out in prayer, "Lord, save me." He remembers at the time thinking more about being saved physically rather than spiritually. But even as he inaudibly uttered these words, God heard Mike's desperate cry and chose to answer him. "Alvin," the Lord called Mike by his given name, "if I save you, what will you do about it?" Mike answered, "Lord, if you save me, I promise to serve you the balance of my life." Mike had no sooner said these words than the Lord touched his paralyzed body and healed him, not only from the effects of the moonshine, but healed Mike's very soul. Mike Martin had been saved. But what would he do about it? Jacinta Tegman, Krista's current chief executive officer, finds inspiration for her own role at the helm of the ministry Mike would eventually found by reflecting on Mike's story of salvation and this incredible, audible encounter with the Lord. Mike's salvation story proves that the God of the Bible does in fact exist today, and that He still speaks to His people, if only they're willing to listen.
In my role as CEO, it's really helpful to kind of reflect on how we began, and particularly on the life of our founder. Just a man of God whose life was intersected by just the amazing power of God in saving him, healing him, kind of redeeming him. And then out of this heart of gratefulness, he wanted to make a difference in the lives of young people who were troubled, and came to found what we now know as Christa Ministries out of this deep sort of, I guess I would say that God had been so good to him and had so revolutionized his own life. He felt like many of the problems the world was facing, if people would just come to faith in Christ, their lives would be transformed. And as the newer CEO now, kind of looking back on that foundation, I would say the things that I am grateful for are that he was a man of deep faith, that he wasn't just a do-gooder, right? But that he partnered with the Holy Spirit and seen lives transformed. And that started obviously with young people, and our senior community extends now, all over the world, but loved that foundation was built on his own personal experience with Christ and the transformative power that is still available. And all these years later, I say, that's what we're still about. So yes, I really tried to model my leadership after those principles that, I always tell our team, we can only give what we have, right? We give out of the abundance of what we have. So first we start with our own relationship with the Lord, and then out of just compelled by that love that we ourselves have experienced, we give because we know that Jesus is the answer for all the ills, all the struggles, all the challenges in our world. And, 75 years later, we're still seeing that same power transforming lives today.
Mike's eventual ministry started with that divine appointment. It was the beginning of a lifelong relationship with the Lord that Mike couldn't wait to tell everyone around him about. The first thing Mike did after being saved was tell Viv, but his enthusiasm at what had just happened made her think it was still the moonshine, not Mike, talking. After a few weeks of trying to explain to Viv how God had spoken to him and radically changed his life, Mike and Viv attended an evangelical tent revival meeting in their town. There, Viv experienced for herself what Mike had been trying to tell her, and accepted Jesus as her Lord and Savior. From that day forward, the Martins were a Christian couple, drinking, dancing, and moonshine, losing their attraction and quickly becoming forgotten. Together, the two grew in their faith. At the same time, Mike's career in the gasoline business continued to prosper. He was doing so well that the Richfield Oil Company hired him to oversee 100 service stations in eastern Washington. Believing this was a real opportunity for advancement, Mike took the position, working for Richfield for a few years before going into the wholesale gasoline business for himself. During this time, the Martins joined a local church, taught Sunday school, and continued to serve the Lord. By all accounts, it looked like this was what Mike was supposed to be doing with his life now that he was saved, enjoying the prosperity the Lord was blessing him with and following God's call to serve by attending church and leading his family well. Eric Henriksen, who heads up Christa Camps, one of the many members of the ministry family, reflects on the example of faith Mike and Viv showed through their simple yes to the Lord. It's that faith and obedience without compromise to what the world preaches that continues to guide Eric in the work he does with Christa Camps.
I just love their faith. I love their honesty too. As you look through their story, they had so much, living for themselves, right? Living kind of from party to party. And that's so much our American culture, right? Of like what feels good, whatever I want to do. I'm my own God, independence, and then they have that come to Jesus moment where, I think Mike had some, bad drinking basically. And the Lord said, I want you for my kingdom. And Mike responds, and and Vivian soon after. And so I love the honesty, and that is so much what happens in a camper's journey too, where you're honest with your life. Am I living my life for myself, and all the pleasures of sin and the sinfulness that we get ourselves into, that I got myself into. And then you have this come to Jesus moment of like, you know what, it is not working. Living for myself is not working. If I live for Jesus, that's where real life is. And you see that in the story of Mike and Vivian and their faithfulness. We're standing on the legacy of that faithfulness. So thankful for them.
Mike and Viv were undoubtedly living a life of faith after their salvation. A life of faith many of us can aspire to. But there was more God had for Mike Martin. Much more. A few months later, Mike heard the voice of God a second time. It was 2 a.m., and Mike woke up with what he thought was a fever. Turning to Viv to ask what he should do, Mike heard his given name called once again, Alvin. Knowing this time that the voice was in fact the Lord's, Mike replied, "Yes, Lord." Once again, God spoke to Mike. "Time is so short, and there are so many lost." The words broke Mike's heart. He turned to Viv, woke her up, and told her he had been called into full-time service for the Lord. Mike Martin was ready to serve. But how Mike would serve the Lord was a different question entirely. That next morning, seeing as he was now in full-time Christian service, Mike decided to go tell his pastor that God had audibly spoken to him and called him into service. Surely a pastor would know the correct next steps for Mike to take. When Mike walked into his pastor's office at 7 a.m. that morning, recounting how God had told him, "Time is so short, there are so many lost," the pastor simply stared at Mike, finally telling him that he must have had a bad dream. "If the Lord had wanted you, He would have called you early in life," the pastor said. "He would have called you when you were in high school, and you would have been able to go to college and seminary to prepare for the ministry. But you're a businessman, married, and have 3 children." Mike's takeaway from their conversation: his pastor believed God was calling Mike to work for the church by supplying the finances for someone else to do ministry. But Mike knew that wasn't what he felt God saying. He knew God was calling him, Mike Martin, to do something to save the lost, something more than just giving the money he had made in the oil business to help someone else do the searching, saving, and discipling.
This podcast is based off By Faith, the story of King's Garden. This book outlines the wondrous ways that God used Mike and Vivian Martin in the lives of almost everyone they met. Beginning with the circumstances surrounding Mike's conversion to Christianity, the book takes readers through many, many miracles that evidence God's work. If you are looking to read an impactful story that challenges your faith and encourages you to look for the evidence of God in your life, you should pick up a copy by visiting byfaithbook.com. That's byfaithbook.com.
For years after he was called into ministry, Mike struggled with what that call actually looked like. Yes, there were assurances here and there that Mike was on the right path, but for the most part, those early years of full-time service for the Lord were characterized by a lot of struggle, doubt, and faith without much proof of fruition. Bob Lonick, Krista's CEO from 2006 to 2018, thinks this season of testing and trial is what ultimately set Mike up for all Krista would one day become, making him a better servant, leader, and disciple in the process.
My favorite part of the book, he's starting his deal, and I don't know if you've seen any of those pictures. He started working with kids, and it became a lot of kids. And so you get noticed when you work with a lot of kids. And some pastor asked him if he could go preach in the church. And Mike, being a smart guy, had a pastor friend who was sort of his mentor and encourager. So the guy asked Mike to speak in church. And he said, "No, I'm not a preacher." And then he asked his pastor friend, Axel Verdeen, I think was his name. He asked him, "Gee, what should I do?" He asked me to preach, and I'm not a preacher. And he said to Mike, "Unless you walk through the doors God opens, He may not keep opening for you. And I love that God is active. He wants to lead us. He wants to grow us. And all things work together for good to them that love the Lord, whether you like it or not. The Bible talks a lot about chiseling, and Mike got chiseled away at so many times.
During this season of discernment, Mike kept working in the oil and gasoline business, even as that industry had its own ups and downs throughout the Second World War. Eventually, Mike found work in a tire store, where things took a turn for the worst. During his time selling tires, Mike applied for and attended Bible college, learning what it would take to start and run a ministry. All the while, Mike and Viv worked to share the gospel with anyone and everyone they came in contact with, taking the call to live by faith literally in their own lives as well. But what did this by faith life look like exactly? Well, for Mike and Viv, it looked like choosing to trust God in all areas, with everything, from their finances and the jobs they took, to the food on their table and the very roof over their heads. Yes, money was tight. Yes, there were times when Viv didn't know what she would feed her children for dinner. But amidst the uncertainty, the Martins were able to witness God move in truly miraculous ways, providing money, food, jobs that worked with Mike's Bible school schedule, and even housing when a solution seemed all but impossible. Michael Martin was just a young child during those early days of living totally dependent on God, but the miracles his family witnessed still stay with him.
I know money was a huge issue in those days, and I think it helped lead to my father's very early passing. But I didn't personally feel it. But there were parts of that life that were amazing to me, because my dad started living by faith, that is, without gainful employment. While I was a little kid, I probably was no more than 3 or 4 years old when Mom and Dad started living by faith. And I remember often that they would get on their knees in the couch to pray for the food for the day. And I never went hungry. You can tell from my body today that I haven't starved to death. But I didn't personally. I was too young. I think my brother felt a little of the stress. I think my sister did. But they are older than me, and I was the last child. So I never worried, and I never had any of that, but I know it was stressful for Mom and Dad.
Jacinta, whose own work in ministry somewhat mirrors Mike and Viv's trajectory of humble beginnings before realizing God's ultimate call, believes Mike recognized success in the worldly sense for what it was, hollow. Listen in as Jacinta shares more of her own by faith story and her reflections on the Martins' choice to fully live their lives for the Lord.
I've been at Christian Ministries. If I go back to the earliest days, I started when I was about 16 years old in the laundry room of our senior living facility. So that was my first entree into this amazing organization. And then later came back to Krista with the Ministry of World Concern. So that's our international relief and development arm. And I started out working with local churches to get them involved in our work, and kind of grew through that role to eventually oversee all of our international operations. And from there, I became the president of World Concern, and I served all my time in World Concern was about 11 years. And from there, just loved Krista, loved the actual work of ministry, but did see kind of a greater role I could have in when my predecessor as the CEO of Krista announced his retirement. I just felt like the Lord was tugging on my heart to make myself available for perhaps even a greater role of oversight of all of our amazing ministries. So that happened about 5 years ago. So I'll total at Krista 16 years as an adult and probably a year as a student in high school. When I think about Mike Martin and what he experienced in his own professional life, that he was very successful and really did have the American dream. But having achieved it sort of at a younger age, I think he recognized that it was hollow. It's almost like a lie, isn't it? And many people don't achieve it or are always pursuing it. So maybe they don't have that experience of success. But when you've achieved success and then you still find it to be hollow and meaningless, and when he encountered the love of God that so transformed his life, I think it was an easy decision for him to lay aside sort of all the trappings of success and, security, and walk into this relationship with Christ in this way of just total faith and dependence that God is who he says he is, that if he is in something, he will provide for it financially and emotionally, spiritually, all those components. And that then becomes the most exciting adventure that you can possibly be on. So I feel like Mike and Vivian Martin's example to all of us here at Christa, even today, is this ability to say, God, you're the most important thing, that serving and following you is the greatest privilege we will ever have, and everything we've done up to this time just pales in comparison to those amazing, powerful, transformative, and it's really an adventure of a lifetime to trust completely that God is leading and guiding and still cares about people. Love that about him.
Living by faith may have required even more faith than the Martins believed they had. But there's no other way they wanted to live after seeing how God was using them to impact the lives of others. Though God had not yet formally started the Martins' ministry in these early years, hadn't given them thousands of souls to share the gospel with the minute Mike said yes, God was undoubtedly working in their lives, transforming their own hearts and pruning away the parts not yet totally aligned with Him as a way to set them up for all that was to come. And come those days of upfront center stage ministry would, and did, starting with Mike and Viv's choice to walk whatever path God put in front of them. As Mike finished up his studies at Bible college and continued to live a life of total dependence on God, the Lord made it clear that He was calling them to more, in the form of a young girl, their daughter Joyce's friend Joanne. Joanne's parents had recently divorced, and so this young woman, desperate for a place to call home, asked Joyce if she could stay with her family for a while. The Martins, hardly a penny to their name, and with 3 of their own young children to feed and clothe, impossibly said yes to Joanne's request. And what began as a simple roof over the head of a soul seeking shelter would only multiply from there, as Mike and Viv put their faith in action and trusted God with what little they had to change the world. From here, the Martins' story would quickly become the stuff of near legend, inspiring countless others to live out their own by-faith stories. Jacinta takes the Martins' sincere response to the Lord's call as a personal challenge for herself and for the Christa of today, a challenge to live up to their founder's desperate love for and dependence on God.
I think a challenge that we have all these years down the road is that we are not as desperate for God, perhaps, as Mike and Vivian were in those early days. I mean, they were praying for money to come in to just feed the team and for the students and those they were caring for. And now we're far more sophisticated, aren't we? We're not living in a season of poverty like in 1948, 1949. The greater Seattle area was really economically depressed. There was a lot of need, a lot of hardship and heartache. And so their lives modeled this utter dependency on God because there was nothing else. And here now, all these years later, we could say, well, we're not as dependent because, we have life insurance, or, we know we have a budgeting process and we know how money's going to come in, et cetera, et cetera. And I think for us today, we are still as dependent on God. I think a lot about the insecurity in our nation, just physically and in every way. And the idea of that we have ever had control is really an illusion. And so as the CEO, kind of looking at how Mike Martin led this organization with utter dependence, I might say it might just be a little tiny bit more challenging because we don't recognize our dependence as much. So I think it really behooves me as the leader in this season to just remind myself and to remind our team, we are still as dependent on God's goodness, His faithfulness, His provision, His protection, as much as, or even more so, like I always say, the gospel is needed now more than ever. It isn't that like those were for, those old days, right? But today, we're still battling, if you will, for the lives of young people and for our seniors and even in our own lives in all the aspects of Christa Ministries.
Mike's own battle is far from over, though. There's a much longer road to walk as what started with housing one student turned into a ministry that would spread like wildfire throughout the Seattle area, catching up thousands of teens in its wake and birthing the first iteration of Christa Ministries, King's Teens.
Thanks for listening to By Faith, a short series podcast that retells the miraculous story of founder Mike Martin's journey to create the foundational ministry that is now called Christa. If you enjoyed something from today's episode, would you let us know? You can do that by leaving a review on this podcast or by reaching out to us at purposely.com. Christa Camps has been part of the Christa family since 1962 and transforms lives through joyful, character-building camp experiences. Today, the focus continues to be challenging campers to grow spiritually and build relationships with friends, counselors, and their creator in the outdoors. You can get involved with Christa Camps by visiting christacamps.org.